If you open that door, Ezekiel, this whole valley's gonna drown in blood. Before he was hunted like an outlaw, Silas Boone was just another dusty cowboy drifting through life. But one wrong bullet and one proud Apache woman with a deadly secret changed everything. This is a true Wild West tale of betrayal, curses, buried gold, and a love that defied fate. True Wild West Stories proudly invites you to ride along. Don't blink. You won't want to miss a second. The sound of a gunshot cracked through the haze of whiskey breath and cigar smoke, slicing the stillness inside the Dry Creek saloon like a butcher's cleaver. The cue ball stopped mid-roll on the pool table. The ball game on the radio turned into white noise. Conversation died in men's throats. Even the jukebox lights flickered for a beat. A man lay on the floor, face down, blood spreading fast beneath him like ink in a thirsty page. He was known, even respected, in the wrong kinds of ways. Jasper Langford, a well-dressed gambler who always seemed to win more than luck should allow. Rich, loud, and a bastard through and through. At the corner table sat Silas Boone, tall, lean, leather-worn and dust-covered, like a man carved straight from the desert wind. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his jaw was set like iron. On the table in front of him, still warm, was his revolver, just set down. Not 5 seconds before the gunfire rang out. No one moved. Then someone screamed. "He's got a gun! He shot him!" The words rippled like poison through the saloon. In a town like Dry Creek, truth traveled slow, but accusations moved like wildfire. Marshal Greeley pushed through the crowd, his boots stomping with authority, hand already resting on the butt of his Colt. A big man with a gray mustache and a reputation for being fair when he could afford to be, and brutal when he couldn't. "Boone!" the marshal barked, eyes flicking from the corpse to the revolver. "Step away from the table. Hands where I can see 'em." Silas stood slowly, arms slightly raised, voice calm, like the hush before a storm. "That gun wasn't fired. You know damn well I wouldn't shoot a man from behind, Greeley." But it didn't matter. A murmur rose. Pushing through chairs and curses, he slammed through the saloon's swinging doors. Outside, the desert night greeted him like an old enemy. Cold, open, merciless. Dusty, his horse, waited by the post, tied loose like always. Silas vaulted onto the saddle in one fluid motion, kicked his heels, and Dusty took off, hooves tearing up the dirt road under a sky full of stars. Behind him, gunshots rang out and voices chased after. "Stop him! He's got blood on his hands!" But the night swallowed Silas whole. The wind carried the scent of whiskey, blood, and betrayal as Dry Creek stood stunned behind him. Silas Boone was a wanted man now, and the chase had begun. Chains rattled faintly in the narrow canyon, sharp and eerie beneath the whispering Nevada wind. The moon hung cold and round above the desert, casting a pale glow over sandstone cliffs that rose like the broken teeth of giants. Silas Boone reined in Dusty, narrowing his eyes toward the sound. It wasn't the kind of noise made by wind or wildlife. This was man-made, metallic, repetitive. He dismounted, boots crunching gravel as he moved with quiet purpose toward the shadows between the rocks. The canyon narrowed, the walls pressing in like hands around a throat. That's when he saw her. A young woman, no more than mid-20s, sat slumped against a boulder, wrists bound by thick iron cuffs, chained to a wooden post half buried in the sand. Her long black hair was tangled but proud, eyes sharp even in fear. A deep red scarf was tied around her neck, streaked with dust. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just stared back at him, unmoved. Then a whisper of boots behind him. Silas ducked on instinct. Crack! A rifle barked from the ridge. Dust exploded where his head had been. He rolled behind a jut of stone, pulled his revolver, and returned fire without thinking. The shot rang out, and a grunt echoed off the rocks. A body hit the ground hard. "Damn bounty hounds," he muttered. Another popped up on the left, shotgun raised. Silas didn't wait. One shot to the gut, the man folded like a bad poker hand. "Still breathing?" he called to the woman. She gave him a flat stare. "Does it look like I'm bleeding?" He made quick work of the chain with a pry bar from his saddlebag. Her wrists were raw, but she didn't flinch. When she stood, she brushed off her torn skirt like she'd just stepped off a porch instead of nearly dying. "Name's Boone," he said, tipping his hat. "I didn't ask." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Suit yourself." She looked him up and down with a glare sharp as obsidian. "You have no idea what you just did." "I saved your life." "No," she snapped. "You invited a curse." He blinked. "That's so. Those men weren't just bounty hunters. They work for someone who doesn't forget. You've put a mark on yourself." Silas gave a dry chuckle. "Honey, I was already marked when I crawled out of my mother with my fist balled up." She turned away, pacing to retrieve a blade one of the men had dropped. Moved like someone who'd known violence longer than comfort. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, laced with warning. "My name's Naomi Yazi. You don't know me, and you don't need to. But if you ride with me now, you'd better be ready to die." Silas holstered his weapon. "Seems like that's the only thing I've ever been ready for." They locked eyes, hers filled with fire, his with the tired calm of a man who's lived too long under the barrel. Then came the sound. Distant hooves, dozens, echoing, getting closer. Naomi turned her head slightly. "They're coming." "You bought yourself 5 minutes." Silas swung into Dusty's saddle, reached down a hand. She hesitated for just a breath, then took it. As the first shadowed riders appeared on the far ridge, the two figures vanished deeper into the canyon, moonlight trailing behind them like a silent witness to a pact neither of them had asked for. The desert gave no answers, only more questions. The fire cracked quietly, throwing flickering shadows against the canyon walls. Naomi's silhouette danced along the rock face, tall, proud, untamed. The flames licked at the chill air, the wind carrying a low, constant howl through the narrow ravine. Silas Boone sat across from her, hat tilted back, chewing the twig of sagebrush and watching her like one might watch a wolf from across a river. Interested, but wary. She hadn't spoken much since the escape, just nodded when he offered jerky, muttered thanks over the flask. But now, beneath the hush of the desert and the stars that spilled like dust from heaven, she finally stirred. "You ever hear of Ezekiel Redhawk?" she asked, voice low, eyes locked on the fire. Silas narrowed his gaze. "Name rings a bell? Former Army scout, turned prospector, turned something worse." Naomi gave a slow nod. "He was my father's blood brother. Swore an oath over fire and bone, Apache, don't take that lightly. Silas leaned forward slightly. What happened? She picked up a stick and drew a crooked spiral into the sand. They found gold, deep in the belly of Beartooth Ridge. My father made the map. He wanted it shared, protected. Silas snorted softly. There's always a damn map. Naomi's stare could have cut stone. Ezekiel wanted it for himself. Slit my father's throat while he slept. Tried to take the map, but it wouldn't burn, wouldn't drown, because it was marked. Marked? She reached into her coat and pulled a leather pouch, opened it slowly. Inside was a bundle wrapped in dark cloth, spotted with old, dried blood. She unwrapped it, revealing a brittle piece of hide, symbols burned into its surface. Apache glyphs danced across it like warnings from the past. He bound it with a blood curse, Naomi said. Anyone who steals it dies with their eyes open. Silas leaned back, hands up in mock surrender. Well, ain't that charming bedtime material? She didn't smile. I'm serious, she said. This isn't some saloon tale. You saw what happened back there. Those men weren't just after me, they were after this. He studied the markings. Symbols meant nothing to him, but something about the hide. It didn't feel right. The air around it seemed heavier. You believe this'll lead to gold? I know it does. And the curse? She met his gaze squarely. I watched my uncle try to touch it after my father died. He clawed at his own throat, bled out screaming words I didn't understand. His eyes never closed. A long silence passed between them. Silas finally exhaled, shaking his head. Hell, I've played cards with drunks more convincing than this. Naomi stood slowly, wrapping the map again with careful hands. You think you're above it all, just a saddle tramp with no roots, no gods. I believe in bullets and bad timing. Well, believe this. If you keep riding with me, this curse becomes your story too. The fire popped loudly between them. Silas met her eyes. You ever think maybe it's not a curse? Maybe your father just picked the wrong partner. She stepped forward, chin high. That map doesn't leave my bloodline. I'll die before I let it fall into another white man's hands. He stood too, a beat slower, the smirk gone from his face. Good. Because the way things are going, dying sounds damn likely. Another gust of wind howled through the rocks, then a crunch, faint but real. Footsteps in gravel. From beyond the firelight. Both froze. Silas drew his revolver. Naomi stepped sideways, hand at her waist, gripping a blade. They stared into the darkness beyond the flame's reach. A shadow shifted. Somewhere out there, someone was watching. And they weren't alone anymore. The gunfire thundered through the canyon like a damn war drum, each shot ricocheting off the jagged stone walls until it was impossible to tell where the bullets were really coming from. Silas Boone pressed his back against the cold granite, breathing hard through clenched teeth. Sweat trickled down the side of his face despite the cool desert night. Dusty wasn't an option here. No room to ride, no cover but rocks and shadows. Across from him, crouched low behind a dead mesquite stump, Naomi reloaded a small revolver she'd taken from one of the fallen men 2 nights ago. Her blade was still wet with blood from earlier. Her eyes met his, calm, sharp, not a trace of panic. They didn't need to speak. From higher up the ridge came the voice of Clayton Dillard, smooth and cocky as ever. Come on out, Boone. I ain't got a bullet with your name on it, but I'll damn sure carve it in myself. Silas hissed, bastard still loud as ever. He has 5 men, maybe 6, Naomi said quietly. Too many for a straight fight. Silas gave a tight nod, then looked up at the overhang above. Jagged rocks perched like crooked teeth, held only by time and luck. He motioned upward. "You cover me?" She didn't respond with words, just checked her revolver, then ducked out and fired twice toward the voices above. Silas dashed to the base of the slope, scrambled up like a wild animal, boots slipping on loose stone. Bullets chipped the rocks around him. One grazed his sleeve. He reached the ledge, shoved his shoulder against a flat slab of stone and pushed with everything he had. The rocks groaned, trembled, then gave way. A landslide of boulders roared down the narrow trail, smashing into the men below. Screams echoed, followed by curses and panicked shouts. Naomi had moved during the chaos, knifing one man who tried to flank from the left. She moved like a shadow, vicious and precise. The man never even cried out, just dropped. Silas ducked back down, rifle in hand now, scanning through the dust. Then, Clayton. The bastard stepped through the settling rubble like a ghost, his shotgun aimed dead at Silas's chest. "End of the road, Boone." But Silas didn't flinch. "Been hearing that my whole damn life," he said, and fired. Clayton twisted, shot grazing his side, but he returned fire instantly. Silas dropped behind a boulder, cursing. The blast had nicked his ribs. Hot blood warmed his shirt. Clayton closed in. Naomi leapt from above, her blade slicing downward. Clayton twisted just in time. Her knife cut his shoulder, not his throat. The two grappled, fell hard to the ground, rolling over dust and stone. Silas scrambled up, aimed. A shot rang out from one of the remaining bounty men. Silas ducked as the bullet cracked into the rock beside his head. "Naomi!" "Move." She kicked off Clayton's chest, rolled away just in time as Silas fired, hitting the shooter in the neck. Blood sprayed. Silence fell, briefly. Clayton staggered up, one eye swollen, panting like a bull. Then came the sound. A rush of water. Fast, angry. Behind them, the canyon wall dipped into darkness where a narrow river flowed underground, a gaping hole in the earth's belly. Naomi looked at Silas. "We'll die down there." "We'll die here for sure." Clayton raised his shotgun. No time. Silas grabbed Naomi's hand and jumped. They plunged into black water, swallowed whole by the cold and the dark, disappearing into the underground current before Clayton could pull the trigger again. The river didn't care who they were, but it carried them anyway. The morning light slanted through the dusty window of the sheriff's office, casting long bars across the desk. Marshal Greeley sat still, boots propped on a chair, a .45 caliber shell casing turning slowly between his fingers. The brass glinted faintly as he held it to the light. "Not a match," he muttered. The coffee on his desk had gone cold. He didn't care. The night before still played on loop in his mind. The shattered lamp, the gunfire, the bodies. And Silas Boone tearing through the saloon doors like a ghost with fire on his heels. At first it was clear-cut. Silas was trouble on two legs. He drank too hard, fought too fast, and had a mouth that couldn't shut itself. But now, this casing, found wedged under the piano, didn't match Boone's revolver at all. The door creaked. It was Martha, the saloon owner, eyes red from little sleep and too much smoke. "You said you wanted to talk," she said. Marshall motioned her in, gesturing to the chair across from him. "You served him that night? Silas?" "Hell yes. Same as always. Rye. Neat. He was nursing it, not starting shit. That gambler, though, Frank Withers, he was loud, twitchy, had been flashing cash around for a week. Anyone else near the bar when it went down?" She shrugged. Place was packed. But when the shooting started, I saw a guy near the back, never seen him before. Clean boots, didn't smell like horse or gunpowder. just disappeared after the bang. Marshall nodded slowly, and no one saw where the shot came from. Hell, everyone hit the floor too fast. He sighed. Thanks, Martha. That'll be all. As she left, he turned the casing again. Something wasn't sitting right. The shell was .40 caliber. Boone carried a .38 old model Colt, had since the day Marshall had first cuffed him 10 years ago. Out on the street, Dry Creek was waking slow. The church bell clanged once, summoning the faithful, or at least the bored. Greeley stepped into the light, boots crunching dirt, and crossed the road to speak with Reverend Collier. The old preacher stood by the fence, sipping from a chipped mug, looking like a man who hadn't seen peace in decades. You still hear confessions? Marshall asked. Collier chuckled. Only the kinds worth keeping. I'm looking for someone who was in that saloon, maybe kept quiet because they feared they were next. The Reverend raised an eyebrow. You think Boone's innocent? I think something stinks worse than the outhouse in July. Back in the canyon, far from any pew or badge, Silas crouched near the mouth of a narrow cave, watching the sunlight creep across the floor. Naomi sat further in, wrapping her ankle with a torn strip of cloth. You ever think maybe we should have just let that river take us? She muttered. Silas snorted. Hell, it tried. But I ain't ready for any afterlife where I gotta listen to your sass for eternity. She gave him a look, but it softened slightly. In the flickering light, she looked tired, bone deep. Why'd you come back for me that night in the canyon? She asked. Silas stared out toward the sunlit gorge. Didn't plan to. Just did. That map my father died for. It'll kill us too, won't it? He didn't answer. Back in town, Marshall Greeley stood in his office again, staring at a map pinned to the wall. Dry Creek, outlying ridges, abandoned mines, old trails folks forgot. Then came a knock, short, fast. Deputy Hank stepped in, face pale. Sheriff, word just came in. Spit it out. Ezekiel Redhawk was spotted near the Nevada line. He's heading this way. Greeley's jaw tightened. Ezekiel, a name that hadn't passed his lips in over a decade. A name tied to graves, debts, and blood oaths too old to forget. He turned back to the shell casing still resting on the desk. The pieces were moving, and now so was the man behind them. The torchlight flickered madly against the thick morning fog, casting wild shadows over the muddy riverbank. The air reeked of wet earth and wood smoke, thick enough to choke a mule. Somewhere beyond the trees, frogs croaked warnings, or maybe curses. Silas Boone crouched low behind a fallen cypress, one hand on his bleeding shoulder, the other gripping the butt of his revolver. Naomi knelt beside him, pressing a damp cloth against the wound, her brow furrowed. They're coming in from the north, too, she whispered. They've surrounded the bend. I counted 6, Silas muttered. Could be more. A distant voice rang out across the fog, firm, regretful, and unmistakable. Silas Boone, this is Marshall Greeley. Come out with your hands where I can see 'em. Naomi's jaw clenched. He's serious. He always is, Silas grunted, wincing as he shifted. They were boxed in, flat out. One way was the river, too shallow for a swim, too thick for cover. The other was uphill through thick brush, and with his shoulder the way it was, he wouldn't make it half a mile without bleeding out or collapsing. Naomi looked at him, then toward the shadows moving through the fog. You need to give yourself up, she said. He laughed bitterly. Sure, maybe they'll let me pick which tree to hang from. I'll talk to them. You think that badge is going to stop a bullet once the mob gets riled? She fell silent, staring into the fog. Then, without a word, She grabbed a nearby branch, dipped it in the muck, and started smearing it over his shirt and face. "What the hell? Camouflage," she said. "If you won't run, we'll vanish." They worked quickly, rubbing mud on their clothes, faces, even Dusty's flanks. Silas scooped a handful of damp moss and shoved it into the barrel of his gun. "Smoke," he muttered. A moment later, Naomi set fire to a small pile of moss and wet leaves, using the last match from her pocket. The smoke rolled out low and thick, curling through the fog like a living thing. It worked. Voices up the slope grew confused. Footsteps slowed, unsure. One deputy called out, "I can't see shit!" Silas took Naomi's hand. "This way." They moved like ghosts, low and silent, using the cover of the smoke and mud to circle around the narrow trail by the river's edge. Every movement was agony for him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Naomi kept one arm wrapped around his waist, half carrying him. A shout behind them, then a shot. The bullet tore past, grazing his upper arm. Silas grunted but didn't fall. "Almost there," Naomi said. "Keep going." Dusty whinnied as they reached the edge of the trees. The horse was half covered in muck, reins tangled around a fallen branch. Naomi jumped up first, then helped Silas swing into the saddle behind her. Another shot cracked the air. Naomi kicked Dusty hard. The Mustang lunged forward, hooves slapping through shallow water, mud flying. Behind them, Greeley's men shouted, firing blindly through the fog, but the smoke and shadows swallowed the shots. They rode hard into the rising mist, the river shrinking behind them. Blood dripped from Silas's sleeve, warm and steady. He slumped slightly, but Naomi held tight. The town behind them had made its choice. Ahead, only the unknown remained, but behind, the hounds of law were gaining. The flames cracked and spat under the dark sky of Black Mesa, throwing long shadows across the broken plateau. The fire cast a glow on the faces of hardened men, mercenaries, ex-convicts, bounty hunters too ruthless for the badge. They sat in a crude circle, their rifles leaning close, fingers twitchy with anticipation. Ezekiel Redhawk stood in the center, his silhouette cut sharp against the firelight. His long duster whipped in the dry wind, revealing boots stained with red earth. His voice, when it came, was slow, bitter, and full of venom. "You think this is about gold?" he asked, gaze sweeping the crowd. "You think I want a piece of land to die rich on?" A few men chuckled, others remained still. Ezekiel stepped closer to the fire, pulled something from the inner pocket of his coat, a scrap of worn canvas, edges burnt, symbols faint. "This," he growled, holding it high, "is a piece of prophecy." He tossed it into the flames. The canvas curled, blackened, then flashed into smoke. A few men shifted uncomfortably. "I came from nothing," Ezekiel continued, pacing now, voice growing. "Born in a shack with a dirt floor and a drunk for a father. My mother scrubbed blood off saloon floors to buy me shoes. You know what the Yazzies did?" He spat into the dirt. "They laughed. They called my family half-breeds with no tribe." Clayton Dillard stood near the edge of the circle, arms folded tight. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "They think the gold belongs to them," Ezekiel snarled. "Some holy bloodline. A curse, a map wrapped in stories and bones. But I say, what's buried belongs to the ones who dare to dig." He turned, locking eyes with Clayton. "And you. You had Silas Boone in your sights. Let him slip away like a scared pup." Clayton's hand twitched near his belt. "He jumped into a river like a goddamn fish. he snapped. "Tried drowning himself. He won't get far." "He better not," Ezekiel said, stepping close enough for the firelight to gleam in his eyes. "Because every hour he breathes, the map lives." Clayton leaned in, voice low and sharp. "I swore I'd put him in the ground. I aim to keep that." For a long second, the only sound was the fire and the distant rustle of dry wind through rock crevices. Then Ezekiel laughed, a hollow, mirthless bark. "Good, because next time you fail, I won't need your kindling." The men fell quiet. Ezekiel knelt by the fire, grabbed a stick, and poked at the embers until they spit sparks. Long ago, an Apache elder swore that if the veins of the Black Mesa were disturbed, the land would drink the blood of the greedy, he said quietly. "Funny thing about curses. They make good stories, but better leverage." He stood again, turning toward the shadows at the edge of camp. "Now," he said, "we let the dogs sniff." The girl still has the rest of the map. Boone's just an extra corpse waiting to happen. But then, from the far side of the plateau, something echoed. Boom, boom, boom. Drums. Low and slow at first, then building. The sound carried across the canyon like thunder inside bone. Every man in the camp turned to look. Even the wind seemed to hush. Ezekiel narrowed his eyes. "Apache," one of the men whispered. "Damn spirits." "They're no spirits," Ezekiel growled. "They're watching." He stepped to the edge of the cliff, staring into the darkness. "Let them." Behind him the fire cracked again, but in Ezekiel's eyes it was no longer just heat. It was war. Rain came hard and sudden, drumming against the weathered roof of the abandoned cabin. Wind howled through broken slats in the walls, carrying the scent of wet pine and distant thunder. Inside, the dim light of a flickering oil lamp cast warped shadows across the rough wooden walls. Silas sat propped against a stack of splintered crates, shirt peeled away from his left shoulder, where blood still seeped through a makeshift bandage. Naomi knelt beside him, hands steady as she tightened the cloth. "Hold still," she said, her voice taut with focus. "You patch a man up like you've done it before," Silas muttered through gritted teeth. Naomi didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced up at him, her dark eyes unreadable. "Apache women learn fast. You want to survive. You don't wait around for someone else to save you." Silas let out a dry chuckle that turned into a wince. "Hell of a skill set. Shame it doesn't come with a warranty." Naomi smirked, but it faded quick. The storm outside deepened, pounding the roof like a warning drum. Silas shifted, trying to get comfortable. "Why'd you do it?" "Do what?" "Help me. You could have run, left me bleeding in the mud." She didn't meet his gaze. "Because you didn't walk past me when I was tied up like an animal. Doesn't mean I trust you." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Minutes passed, filled only by the sound of the rain and the occasional creak of the old timbers. Then Naomi reached into her pack, pulling out a small oilcloth bundle. She hesitated for a breath, then unwrapped it. Inside was a piece of aged leather, creased and stained, with lines drawn in dark ink, a fragment of a map. Silas's brow furrowed. "That what I think it is?" Naomi held it close, protective, but didn't pull it away. "It's my father's. It shows part of the Machvang, the golden vein. The rest is scattered or burned. And Ezekiel? He knows enough, but not all." Silas leaned in slightly, gaze fixed. "You trust me with this?" No, she said flatly. I trust the fact that you don't care about gold. Not yet, anyway. And I need someone who doesn't want to stab me in my sleep. Silas raised an eyebrow. Comforting. She folded the map again, slipping it back into the cloth. This stays between us. You breathe a word of it, I'll make sure you don't breathe again. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the wind slamming against the shutters. Silas let the threat hang in the air, then offered a crooked smile. You've got a hell of a way with people, Naomi Yazzie. Naomi leaned back, arms crossed. I've seen what greed does. This map has killed better men than you. He looked toward the cracked window, where lightning briefly lit the world in white. I'm not better, but I'll get you there in one piece. That's my deal. For the first time, her gaze softened, just a flicker, then gone. Suddenly, the wind slammed the door open with a bang. The lamp guttered, nearly going out. Naomi was on her feet in an instant, hand reaching for the knife tucked in her boot. Silas grabbed the revolver resting near his saddlebag, wincing as pain shot through his shoulder. Outside, the rain poured heavier, and through the misted doorway, a shadow moved. Slow, deliberate, approaching with purpose. Neither spoke. The fire cracked once, then the shadow stopped just short of the doorway. Silas raised his voice, low and tense. You lost, friend. Silence. Then came the soft creak of leather, and the unmistakable click of a hammer being drawn back. And just like that, the cabin turned into a trap with only two exits, the storm behind them, or the steel waiting at the door. The desert roared like a wounded beast. Sand whipped sideways, carving invisible blades across exposed skin. The sky had disappeared, swallowed by a swirling wall of yellow and red dust. Naomi could barely see Silas 5 feet ahead, just the silhouette of his broad shoulders and the faint glint of his revolver raised high. Keep low, he shouted, but the words were snatched by the storm, lost in the howl. Naomi wrapped the scarf tighter around her face, every breath like inhaling fire. Her heart pounded so loud it nearly drowned out the distant pop-pop of gunfire. They'd been moving toward the Navajo Trail, following old hoofprints in the sand, when the wind turned mean. And that's when the bastards came, out of nowhere, masked by the fury of the desert. Clayton Dillard was smart like that, waited for chaos, used it like cover. Silas fired again, the muzzle flash a brief starburst in the swirling dark. Somewhere to their left, someone screamed. Then silence. Naomi stumbled forward, her hand gripping the pistol Silas had handed her just the night before. Her fingers were slick with sweat, knuckles white. She had never fired it, not in a real fight, not at a real man. Another shot cracked, this one close, too close. Naomi ducked behind a tumble of jagged rocks, heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't see Silas anymore. The sandstorm thickened, turning every shape into a threat. Footsteps approached, heavy, fast, crunching gravel and grit under leather boots. She froze. A man loomed out of the dust, his bandana pulled up, eyes wide with the thrill of the hunt. He spotted her crouched form, raised his rifle, and hesitated, maybe surprised to see a woman. Big mistake. Naomi screamed and fired. The gun kicked back violently, but the bullet struck home. The man dropped, a gurgled grunt escaping his throat before he slumped sideways into the dust. Naomi stared at him, frozen. Blood was soaking into the sand beneath his body, turning it into thick red mud. Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't even blink. She had killed someone. The pistol trembled in her hands. Tears welled up, mixing with the grit in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't afford to, not here, not now. Another shot rang out nearby. Silas yelled something, maybe her name. Naomi snapped out of it. She stood, limbs shaking, and ran toward the sound. The sand tore at her clothes, dragged at her legs, but her fear had changed. It wasn't the kind that paralyzed. It burned. It drove her forward. She found Silas crouched behind a low ridge, reloading, blood streaked down one side of his face. "You okay?" he grunted. Naomi just nodded, lips tight. She didn't mention the man, didn't say a word. But the way she held the pistol, grip firm now, steady, that told Silas everything. He gave her a short, sharp nod. No time for more. Together they pushed through the worst of the storm. Shots echoed, less now. The ambushers were either dead, dying, or retreating. The sandstorm began to ease, the sky lightening as the winds pulled back their fury. And that's when Naomi saw it. A thin column of smoke in the far distance, rising like a question mark into the sky. She pointed. There. North by northeast, Silas followed her gaze, squinting. "Traders," he said. "Navajo camp, if we're lucky." Naomi said nothing. She looked down at her hands, still dirty, still shaking, but no longer afraid of the weight they carried. Something inside her had changed, something she couldn't name yet, and she didn't know whether to mourn it or hold on to it like a shield. As the wind died down, Naomi didn't feel cleaner, only colder. The scent of roasted meat and sweet cornbread filled the narrow canyon, drifting on the breeze like a welcome home song. Evening light poured over the clay-red cliffs, softening every jagged edge. Down below, in the heart of the Apache village, firelight flickered from dozens of pits, and the low beat of ceremonial drums echoed against the rock. Naomi rode slowly through the outer ring of homes, her head high, shoulders tight. Silas followed behind on foot, limping slightly but keeping pace. Eyes followed them, dozens of them. Silent, judging, unsure. "Too soon," Naomi muttered. Silas caught up to her side. "Want me to wait outside?" She didn't answer, just urged her horse forward toward the center of the village where the fires burned brightest. A group of elders stood near a stone circle, men and women, their faces weathered like carved oak. At their center was an older woman with sharp eyes and white braids wound tightly over her shoulders. Naomi dismounted and gave a respectful nod. "Mother Kay," she greeted. The elder stepped forward, glanced at Naomi, then turned her eyes on Silas. "This man carries blood," she said, voice flat. "His own," Naomi answered quickly. "He bled for me. Fought with me. He's not like the others." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, skepticism thick as the smoke curling from the fire pits. One of the younger men stepped forward, arms crossed. "He's still white." "Still carries a gun." "He also saved your niece," Naomi snapped. Silas said nothing, standing tall despite the pain in his shoulder. He knew his presence here was barely tolerated. This wasn't his land. He was a guest at best and a threat at worst. Mother Kay raised a hand, silencing the others. "We eat tonight," she said. "Let the fire judge what our hearts cannot." The village shifted into motion. Blankets were spread, clay bowls passed hand to hand. Stewed venison, roasted squash, fry bread, and thick coffee with bitter bark herbs filled the air with a grounded warmth. Silas sat near Naomi, back resting against a rock. Children danced near the flames. Drummers beat a slow rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat through the dirt. "I didn't expect this," Silas muttered, accepting a tin cup of coffee from a shy young girl. Naomi managed a tired smile. "Neither did I, but the peace was heavy, not free. It sat on their shoulders like a storm cloud waiting to break." Later, as the fire crackled low and the food was nearly gone, an old man stepped forward. His bones were thin, voice rasped from decades of wind and smoke. He wore a coyote pelt over one shoulder, eyes milky from age, but burning still with something deeper. "I was there," he said, "when the white men came the first time, with shovels and greed in their bellies, with empty prayers and full pockets. The village fell still. They dug too deep," he said. "They struck the bone of the mountain and woke something that does not sleep." He turned to Naomi and Silas. "You carry part of that curse with you. In your hands, on your map." Naomi clutched her satchel instinctively. "If the gold is disturbed again," the old man continued, "the canyon will not bleed, it will drown. Blood will not flow, it will pour, and no name will be left to speak the tale." A hush settled over the gathering like ash after fire. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, a rider galloped in, hooves pounding like drums of war. He dismounted in one motion, face streaked with dust, voice breathless. "Ezekiel," he gasped. "He's coming. With men, guns. They've reached the edge of the sacred mountain." Naomi stood slowly, her hand tightening into a fist. Silas didn't move, just stared into the fire, the old man's words still burning in his ears. The warmth of the feast lingered, but now it carried the scent of war. The drums had stopped. No wind, no laughter, no crackle of fire. Just silence. Silas stood in the center of the Apache village square, shoulders squared, hands bound with rawhide. Around him a tight ring of villagers watched, without speaking. Some looked confused, others angry. The few just looked away. Naomi stood at the edge of the circle, fists clenched. Her eyes darted from face to face, but found no comfort, only uncertainty. Then came the voice, smooth, confident, poison wrapped in silk. "Well, well," Ezekiel Redhawk drawled as he stepped into the firelight. "The prodigal bastard returns and brings a thief with him." Silas stared, unmoved. "Took you long enough," Ezekiel chuckled, tipping his hat. He was dressed cleaner than usual, boots polished, shirt ironed crisp, a vest lined with gold thread. "I returned because I care about this village," he said to the people, "because I heard a stranger had brought danger to our doorstep." "Liar," Naomi hissed. "You left this village in blood. You betrayed my father and sold the mountain's bones for silver." Murmurs rose. Some villagers looked at each other, uncertain. Others avoided her gaze. Ezekiel spread his arms like a preacher at revival. "I have no reason to hurt my own people," he said smoothly. "But this man, Silas Boone, he was seen fleeing a murder scene, gun still warm. And now he hides among us. Ask yourselves, who brings the trouble?" Silas glared. "You set me up." Ezekiel turned, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's quite an accusation for a man who spent more time running than explaining." "Enough!" cried an elder, stepping forward. Mother Kay. Her voice carried more than volume. It carried age, weight, memory. "We do not judge with noise," she said sternly. "We listen. All voices must be heard before we decide." A low murmur of agreement followed, though uneasy. Ezekiel bowed mockingly. "Of course, Mother Kay. I respect the process." A wooden bench was dragged forward. Silas was pushed onto it. Naomi stood behind him. Ezekiel crossed his arms, smirking. "I have men patrolling the mountain," he said, "to keep the sacred place safe." Naomi stepped forward. "You mean to loot it. You always have. Watch your mouth, girl." Suddenly, something was off. A glint in the dark, movement beyond the firelight. Silas's instincts flared. Then, gunfire. It came from the shadows, explosive, loud. Villagers screamed and ducked. The fire pit overturned in the chaos. Flames hissed and smoked in the dirt. Ezekiel's men burst into the circle, faces covered, rifles raised. "Take the map!" one of them yelled. Silas didn't think. He dove sideways, his shoulder screaming as he hit the ground. Someone kicked over a bench. Naomi screamed something. He didn't hear it. A rifle clattered nearby. Silas rolled, snatched it up, and swung around. "Run!" he shouted. "Now!" Naomi hesitated for a split second, then grabbed a stunned child by the arm and bolted. Villagers scattered like dry leaves in wind. Gunshots tore through the night, echoing off canyon walls. Silas fired back, covering the retreat, the heat of the rifle burning into his palms. His heart pounded, blood roaring in his ears. In the chaos, Ezekiel disappeared into the shadows, a ghost amid flame. The council was shattered, trust gone, and the hunt back on. The flames roared behind them, casting frantic shadows against the canyon walls. Smoke clawed at the sky, swallowing stars. Silas ran with Naomi at his side, lungs burning, boots scraping loose gravel as they reached the jagged ledge of the plateau. Ahead, nothing but air, a sheer cliff, dropping into a black abyss. Naomi skidded to a halt, pebbles tumbling over the edge and vanishing into the void. "There's nowhere else." Silas looked over his shoulder. Muffled shouts rang out. Ezekiel's men were gaining fast. Rifle barrels glinted in the firelight. "We go down," he said, pulling a coil of rope from under his jacket. It was frayed at the ends, but it would have to do. "You're insane," Naomi snapped, voice high and trembling. "Wouldn't be the first time," he muttered, tying one end to a stubborn cedar trunk near the edge. He yanked it twice, solid. "Ladies first." She glared at him, but there was no time for argument. She wrapped the rope once around her waist, braced her boots, and started the descent. Her fingers whitened on the line. The cliffside scraped her elbows raw. Above, the first shot rang out. A second sparked against the rock near Silas's head. He ducked, cursed, and returned fire once, blindly, before grabbing the rope and following Naomi down. The rock face was cold and sharp, unforgiving. Naomi had made it maybe 20 feet down when a shout echoed from above. More bullets ripped past. One cracked a chunk of stone, sending shards raining down. Silas caught up to her just as the rope jerked violently. A chunk of the cliff above broke loose. The cedar tree groaned, roots tearing, rope stretching tight. "Move faster!" he yelled. Naomi said nothing, teeth clenched, sweat streaming down her neck. She tried, but her boot slipped on moss. She screamed. Her hand slid, then caught. She dangled, legs flailing, knuckles scraped raw. Silas swung beneath her, anchoring himself with one boot in a crevice. "Naomi! Look at me, grab my wrist." She hesitated, eyes wide, fear flooding her. "Now, damn it!" She reached. He caught her by the forearm, gritted his teeth, and pulled with every muscle in his back. Her foot found a hold, just enough to lift her weight. Together they slid down the remaining rope, jerky, breathless, until they reached a slanted outcropping that jutted from the cliff like a crooked ledge. They rolled onto it, panting, bruised. Above, the tree finally tore loose. It tumbled, roots and all, crashing down beside them and into the darkness below. And with it, the rope. "Well," Silas gasped, "no going back up." Naomi stared over the ledge, her face pale in the moonlight. That was close. Too close. Suddenly the ground beneath them shifted. The ledge gave way, crumbling inward. They tumbled through a curtain of dust, crashing into a narrow cavern hidden in the cliffside. They hit the ground hard, coughing, groaning. Darkness swallowed them whole. Only the ragged sound of breathing echoed in the hollow space. Then, clack, clack, clack. A slow, deliberate sound of hooves on stone. Somewhere deeper in the cave system, a horse was moving. Alone. Silas reached for his revolver, clicking the hammer back. Naomi whispered, "That can't be Dusty. He was miles away." He didn't answer. The sound grew closer. They weren't alone. Somewhere beneath the cliffs, something stirred, and escape had only begun. Naomi lay still on the cold stone floor, her breath shallow, face pale. A gash streaked across her left shoulder, blood soaking through the sleeve of her buckskin shirt. Silas hovered beside her, torn between panic and helplessness. "Stay with me," he whispered, pressing his bandana against the wound. "You hear me? Don't you dare give up now." Her eyelids fluttered. "I'm not giving up," she mumbled. "I just need a minute." The cave around them was damp and narrow, with a smell of ancient dust and stone that hadn't been disturbed for centuries. The walls, jagged and cracked, seemed to close in tighter the deeper they went. A strange warmth pulsed in the air, unnatural, like the mountain itself was breathing. Silas tore off the rest of his sleeve, wrapped it tight around her shoulder, then glanced up. That's when he saw it. Where Naomi's blood had touched the rock, something shifted. The dark moss-covered wall began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, like embers stirred back to life. Crimson lines spread out from the bloodstain in delicate, intricate patterns, forming what looked like ancient symbols. Apache, old, sacred, and alive. Silas took a step back, eyes wide. "What the hell?" Naomi stirred. Her voice came out hoarse. "It's real." He knelt beside her again. "What is?" She turned her face toward the wall, where the glowing symbols pulsed like a heartbeat. "The mountain's soul." "My father, he told me. The map only shows where, but blood..." She coughed. "Blood opens the way." Silas looked again at the symbols, and suddenly, between the markings, a seam appeared in the rock, a fine, straight crack that hadn't been there before. Slowly, without a sound, the stone began to split apart. A door was opening. Beyond it, a narrow passage wound downward, swallowed by shadows. But what emanated from within wasn't just darkness. It was something older, heavier, like memory, grief, and gold all mixed into one. Naomi grabbed his arm weakly. No one should go further. That place, it's not just cursed, it's sacred. He nodded, still stunned. I believe you now. Her eyes glistened. Promise me. Don't let them take it, no matter what they offer, not even for justice. I swear, he said, and he meant it. But outside, the world had no intention of waiting. A sudden gust of air funneled through the cavern entrance, carrying with it the distant thunder of hooves. Silas froze. Then came the sound, sharp, unmistakable, the neigh of a horse, followed by voices barking orders. Ezekiel. He'd found them. Silas stood quickly, checking the chambers in his revolver. 3 bullets. That was it. He helped Naomi to sit up, though she winced with every movement. We've got to move, he said. She nodded weakly, clutching the blanket he'd draped over her. Silas took one last look at the glowing stone, the secret passage revealed by blood. They hadn't come for gold. They'd come for something far more dangerous. And now Ezekiel was only heartbeats away. Dozens of torches flickered like restless spirits, their flames licking the rock walls of the sacred mountain. Shadows danced across the jagged cliffs as Ezekiel's men fanned out, their boots clanking against stone, rifles raised. Smoke from the torches curled upward, mixing with the pale light of dawn breaking through the circular opening above. The sky well, the old ones called it. A shaft of gold-hued sunlight bathed the ancient natural bridge that spanned the yawning gorge between the outer cavern and the heart of the sacred mountain. Naomi struggled against the rope that bound her wrists. Her jaw clenched as Ezekiel shoved her toward the bridge's edge. "Stop fighting, girl," he sneered. "We're almost there. Just tell me which way leads to the vault. I'll never help you desecrate this place," she spat. Ezekiel leaned close, his breath sour with tobacco and madness. "Oh, you already have. Blood opened the door, didn't it? Yours." She said nothing. The look in her eyes could have turned granite to sand. Behind them, the rock trembled with approaching boots. Silas emerged from the shadows, blood-streaked and limping, but eyes burning with rage. Dust and blood smeared his shirt, the revolver gripped low in one hand, a hunting knife in the other. Clayton Dillard stepped out to meet him, already pulling a long blade from his belt. "You again," Clayton growled. "I told you once back in the canyon," Silas said. "You follow me, I'll plant you in the dirt." Clayton lunged. The 2 men collided on the narrow span of the stone bridge. Blades flashed in the filtered sunlight. Grunts, curses, the scrape of boots on the rocky arch, all swallowed by the howl of wind rising through the chasm below. Naomi twisted free of Ezekiel for just a second, tried to run, but he grabbed her hair and yanked her back, dragging her to the center of the bridge. "You'll watch him die," he snarled. Steel met steel as Silas and Clayton fought like men possessed. Silas ducked a wild slash, drove his shoulder into Clayton's ribs, and they both nearly tumbled off the edge. Loose rocks skittered into the gorge, vanishing into the black. Clayton got a hand on Silas's throat, squeezing, dragging him backward. But Silas wasn't done. With a burst of fury, he slammed his head into Clayton's nose, heard the crunch, then drove his knife into the man's gut. Clayton gasped, staggered. "You bastard!" Silas shoved. Clayton fell. His scream echoed, long and shrill, until it was swallowed by the deep. Silas staggered back, breathing hard, blood dripping from his fingers. Naomi cried out his name, but before she could reach him, Ezekiel raised a pistol to her temple. "One more step and she's next," he barked. Silas froze. Ezekiel pulled something from his coat, a folded hide stained with time. The complete map. He held it up in the torchlight, eyes gleaming. "This is it," he laughed, voice cracking. "The path is mine now. The gold, the mountain, the legend, all of it." His laugh turned to a howl, mad, triumphant, and the ground beneath them began to rumble. The mountain was waking up. The wind howled across the mountaintop like a pack of restless spirits, tearing through the rocky peaks and scattering ash in spirals that danced in the morning light. Naomi stood near the edge, her hair tangled, her face streaked with dried blood and dirt. In her trembling hands was the map, the cursed thing that had led them all here. Its edges curled with flame, the hide crinkling as the fire consumed the last trace of greed's path. The ink blurred, then turned to smoke. Silas stood a few paces behind her, revolver raised, eyes locked on Ezekiel Redhawk. Ezekiel's mouth twisted into a snarl. "You fools," he spat, voice raw. "You think burning a map will stop me? I already know the way. I walked it in my dreams long before you ever drew breath." His boots crunched against loose stones as he stepped toward the sealed entrance carved into the rock face, an ancient archway marked with weathered Apache symbols, now dim under layers of soot and time. Silas moved between him and the stone. "It ends here, Redhawk." Ezekiel laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "You don't get to decide that," he hissed, and drew his pistol in a blur. Silas fired. A single shot cracked the silence. Ezekiel stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and thick, spreading across his shirt like a blooming flower. Yet his lips twisted into a grin, teeth stained red. "You think you've won," he rasped, falling to his knees. "You think killing me buries the gold." He coughed, then collapsed onto his side, laughing hoarsely until the sound gave out. The mountain fell silent again. Only the wind remained. Naomi walked to Silas's side, eyes still locked on Ezekiel's body. "He was never going to stop," she said quietly, "even if we buried the mountain itself." Silas nodded, then turned toward the sacred entrance. "Let it stay sealed." They stood there for a long while, as the wind kicked up ashes from the remnants of the map. Bits of burnt hide fluttered like dark snow, caught in the rising gusts and carried into the valley below. As the sun climbed higher, Silas helped Naomi down the narrow path along the cliff's edge. Her steps were slow, shoulders still bandaged, but her spirit seemed lighter, as if the burden of generations had lifted ever so slightly. They walked in silence, down winding trails carved by time and weather, until they reached the lower slope, where the ancient cemetery of the Apache lay nestled between wind-battered trees. Dozens of stone markers dotted the clearing, some no bigger than a fist, others tall and worn smooth by wind and rain. Colorful beads and feathers hung from branches, swaying gently, whispering stories the living could no longer hear. Silas paused, taking off his hat. Naomi stepped forward, kneeling by one of the markers, older than her memory, but etched with her family's sign. "I used to think the mountain held the legacy," she murmured, "but it's all here. In the bones, in the wind." Silas didn't speak. There was nothing to say, only the sound of wind moving through the canyon, only the ash still clinging faintly to Naomi's fingers, and the path behind them growing colder with every step away. The gold was gone, the blood remained. The first rays of sunlight painted the old town of Dry Creek in a burnt orange hue, the kind that made the dust on the window panes look like gold, and the cracks in the wooden porches feel like wrinkles on an old man's smile. A quiet stillness clung to the streets, like the town was holding its breath. Marshal Greeley stood outside the sheriff's office, mug of black coffee warming his hands. The air still carried the bite of night, but the heat would come soon enough, like it always did. He stared out toward the square, where townsfolk were already beginning to stir, Mrs. Pickett opening her bakery shutters, old Tom sweeping the saloon steps, kids chasing each other through the dust like nothing had changed. And maybe, just maybe, something had. Behind him, a freshly tacked notice flapped in the breeze. Wanted, Silas Boone. The ink still bold, but the corners curled and worn. Marshall reached for it, stared at it for a beat, then peeled it down with a slow, deliberate motion. He folded the poster, slipped it into the pocket of his coat, and took another long sip of coffee. Inside the office, the truth had finally been written down in black and white. The coroner's report, the ballistic match, and the confession of a wounded bounty hunter who had crawled into a Navajo trading post looking for whiskey and salvation. The bullet that killed the gambler didn't match Silas's revolver. It matched a gun traced back to one of Ezekiel Redhawk's men, Clayton Dillard, now buried under half a mountain. Justice, long delayed, had found its path home. In the square, folks had gathered. Some nodded as Silas and Naomi rode in from the west, Dusty kicking up puffs of earth like it had always belonged on these streets. Silas sat straight in the saddle, coat dusty, hat pulled low, but his face was steady. Naomi rode beside him, her posture proud, eyes calm. No more running, no more hiding. Marshall met them halfway. "Boone," he said, tipping his hat. "Marshall," Silas replied. They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Marshall finally spoke. "The town knows. Hell, even Hank Tiller apologized, and he's been mad since 1973. Silas chuckled under his breath. Marshall stepped closer. "You've paid your debt, son. Maybe not in court, but in blood and dust and fire. Far as I'm concerned, you're square with the world." Silas didn't answer right away. He looked around the square, at the cafe, the old church bell, the newspaper boy shouting about cattle prices. It wasn't a perfect town, but it was home once. Naomi leaned over. "We don't have to stay." Silas shook his head. "No, but we don't have to run either." At the corner cafe, the waitress poured 2 steaming cups. Marshall sat alone near the window, watching them from a distance, letting them have their moment. He reached into his coat, pulled out the folded wanted poster and lit it with the end of a match. The flame licked the edges, then curled it into black ash. He set it in the ashtray, muttering, "Damned paper never told the whole story anyway." Outside, Dusty stamped his hoof. Silas gave Marshall one last nod. Naomi waved gently, and together they turned toward the edge of town. The morning sun stretched their shadows long and thin behind them. As they passed the old town sign, Naomi leaned her head lightly against Silas's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just let her. The wind picked up again, same as always in Dry Creek, carrying with it the scent of coffee, horses, and something like peace. No gunshots, no ghosts, just 2 riders, 1 town, and a sky finally wide open. As the dust finally settled in Dry Creek, one truth remained. Sometimes justice doesn't ride in with a badge. It arrives on the back of a bruised horse, led by someone the world had already given up on. This story wasn't just about gold, bullets, or vengeance. It was about dignity, second chances, and the power of keeping one's word, even when the world forgets your name. Naomi and Silas came from opposite worlds, yet both carried pain, pride, and purpose. And in a time where betrayal was as common as dust in the wind, they chose to trust. And maybe that's the rarest kind of courage, trusting someone when it would have been easier to walk away. Sometimes the richest treasure ain't gold, but the peace of knowing you did what was right, even when no one was watching. So what about you? Have you ever stood your ground when no one else believed in you? Have you ever let go of something precious to protect something sacred? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else today. If this story made you pause and reflect, drop a fire in the comments. And where are y'all tuning in from? Let us know your state down below. If you love true Wild West stories with grit and heart, make sure to subscribe to True Wild West Stories so you don't miss the next ride.